You probably heard me talk at the RWU conference about the study in Virginia, speaking of induced demand on the I-95 corridor that Virginia did. I guess it was about 2018. Our very visionary Secretary of Transportation commissioned a study of the I-95 corridor, and that corridor between Richmond and Washington is one of the most congested in the country. It's very unsafe and extremely congested and bumper to bumper. And the question was not just what would be the impact of adding more lanes to I-95, but what would be the impact of more rail service. And so they studied in isolation what would happen if you added one lane in each direction for a 50-mile stretch of the corridor between Richmond and Washington. And besides the fact that it would cost $12.5 billion to do that, the study projected out 10 years and found that in 10 years' time, those 50 miles would be just as congested as they are today. The induced demand is just so unsustainable. You could build more highways out and out and out in every direction, more lanes, and they just fill up. So the solution was to emphasize more trains instead of more lanes, and that's what has led to what they call the Transforming Rail in Virginia project. The state's investing $4 billion in more frequencies of dedicated passenger rail service on dedicated passenger rail tracks between Washington and Richmond. And that's sustainable. There is plenty of research that indicates that when you add more service, the passengers come. It's an axiom that happens, and Amtrak has experienced that. In fact, they have been expanding. They've been mostly adding service through these federal-state partnerships over the recent couple decades. And every time they do, their ridership goes way, way up. 40 million people, millions of people are riding trains now, not just the long-distance trains. And that's been a very vigorous part of growth in passenger rail in this country is the state-supported trains and the corridor trains.
I would like you to drill down on that a little bit, because one of the things that I thought was really significant about your work is you've expanded from one state-supported route to now multiple state-supported routes. And this issue of the state support versus the federal support, what seems to me to be an arbitrary number of 750 miles as the threshold for when the federal government takes responsibility versus the state.
Right.
I mean, I don't know very many states where you have 750 miles of route that's internal to the state. That's certainly not the case in Washington state. So I think it's significant that you were able to expand the number of state-supported routes in a state that has had both Republican and Democratic parties in leadership. So I just trust that you're going to use your vast experience to jam on that theme, because we're really concerned about this issue of the reluctance of states to step in because they don't want to take responsibility for the cost of running the route.
Part of the secret in Virginia has been the rail policies that we've established that involve dedicated state funding for passenger rail. And that's key, because if you have to go to a legislature or you have to go to an administration with your hat out and say, this new route would cost $30 million a year to operate. Well, where is your state going to get $30 million a year to operate, much less the initial capital investments involved? Unless you have a source of funding that is sustainable, reliable, year to year, dedicated to passenger rail, it's extremely hard to convince the decision makers to invest in it, because it means they have to reprogram road money right out of their DOT budget. They have to somehow reprogram it and put it into rail, and all the political consequences and the pushback that you get from that, from people who don't understand what rail can do for them and for their communities. And so if the money's there to be spent for that purpose, then you begin to look for what to spend it on, and that means routes. passenger routes and passenger services. So we started back when Mark Warner, who was governor at the time and is now a senator, commissioned the Governor's Commission on Rail Enhancement for the 21st Century. I was on the commission, and we were tasked with kind of visualizing what a 21st century rail network in Virginia would look like and what it would take to get there. And the first thing we realized was it took money to dedicate to rail. For so long, we've had the misdirected idea that roads are the only thing that you need to invest in for transportation, that and some transit money. And so we only have highway funding. All of our tax resources, our fuel taxes, they go to highway funding and some transit. They typically don't go for rail. And so you've got to divert some source of funding just to rail. I think that is the key. And what Mark Warner did, his administration then, on our recommendation, was he formed back then the first dedicated fund for rail capital investments. And it was at the time only limited to freight rail. But when the time came for us to look into funding our first intercity passenger rail service that would be state supported, the money was there to pay for the capital improvements to the freight rail lines that would increase the capacity enough for the rail lines to want to host the trains. And so we had the money set aside where we could invest in capacity improvements for Norfolk Southern in the case of the first state-supported service. And in exchange, we got a 20-year agreement to host a passenger train on their tracks. So after the state had started 2 more trains, both of them to Norfolk, just piecing together money that otherwise would have gone to roads, the next governor found himself with 3 trains to operate and no operating funds to do it. He could have stopped the trains, but fortunately, what he did, instead of saying, well, there's no more money, so we can't run them anymore, with the help of a lot of advocates, he started the Intercity Passenger Rail Operating and Capital Fund. And that was dedicated to passenger rail operations. Today, what we have is a different thing that is. In 2019, it came as part of the Transforming Rail in Virginia project, and that was to create the Commonwealth Rail Fund, which gets 7.5% of our fuel taxes. It's part of our overall transportation budget in Virginia. Rail now gets 7.5%. And it doesn't sound like much, but it's dedicated strictly to rail, and it comes out millions and millions and millions of dollars to invest in rail every year. And it also allows us to leverage that money and borrow for the future, too. So I would make the case that dedicated rail funding is a key. And you develop a constituency for passenger rail. That's another key, is start putting people on trains. And the ridership will grow, and the demand will grow, and the political support for rail will grow. But you have to start somewhere, and you have to give people the experience. And once they experience it, it becomes a part of their transportation practices. It becomes part of their daily lives. Every time they take a vacation or every time they go from Charlottesville to Washington, they take the train instead of driving. So it becomes commonplace. But you have to start somewhere. And when you do that, more and more people want to ride the trains, and more of them support politicians who support trains. And the harder it is for someone to come along and say, well, I don't support that anymore. So I think service is extremely important, and setting up the government infrastructure to support rail.
So we're having a really difficult time in Washington state to get Washington's DOT with its rail, ports, and freight division, dividing their energies amongst many things. They do not feel particularly focused on using rail to solve transportation problems. They're actually resistant to using rail to fight transportation problems. But you've overcome that. How the heck did you do that?
We started out in the early 70s here. One of our governors broke off the Department of Rail and Public Transportation from VDOT and started a dedicated office for rail, not just passenger rail, freight rail too. And that has become now an authority, the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority, which was, again, part of the public policy advances that came with the Transforming Rail in Virginia initiative. They established at the same time the Commonwealth Rail Fund and the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority. If you just work through your state DOT, they're road dominated. They all are. Their engineering departments are all road based, even if they have an office dedicated to rail. It's very hard for rail to really emerge as a significant part of your transportation infrastructure in a state where you don't have any agency overseeing it. Planning it, scoping it out, hiring the engineers to engineer it, and then to oversee the construction and then oversee the operations. And you need some kind of agency to do that. So you see what I'm talking about with respect to rail public policy? Public policies are what matter. You can't just superimpose investing in planning, constructing rail on top of an infrastructure that is all dedicated to roads. It just doesn't work. You've got to break it off. You've got to start doing things separately with its own funding. And when you do that, then it has its own life. It has its own initiative and its own energy. And I think that's what's happened in Virginia.